All right, buckle up, because today we're going deep into a case that's both fascinating and disturbing.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's the story of Michael Taylor. He was an ordinary butcher from England, but his life took a seriously dark turn. Think demonic possession, exorcism, and a brutal murder.
It's one of those cases that makes you think about good and evil and belief systems. How much do we really understand about the human mind,
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've got a whole mix of articles and some information from a website.
Right.
It all focuses on what happened back in 1974 in Ossett, West Yorkshire. This story, though, it's not your typical true crime case.
Yeah.
It blends psychology and the supernatural in a way that just makes you question everything.
Yeah, you got to be careful not to get too caught up in the sensationalism, but the sources, they offer these different angles on the same events.
Which is crucial in a case like this.
Absolutely.
So let's start with Michael Taylor himself. Before things went wrong, he had a pretty normal life. Butcher, family man, the whole 9 yards.
Right, but there's this turning point. The sources mention a back injury that he suffered, and that led to depression or, withdrawal. Makes you wonder if this vulnerability, if it played a part in what happened later.
That's a really good point. And it's around this time that he finds comfort in religion.
Mm-hmm.
He joined a group called the Gobber Christian Fellowship. But this is where things take a turn, you know what I mean? Michael becomes fixated on Marie Robinson.
Oh, yeah. Marie Robinson.
So she was the group's lay preacher.
Right.
And for anyone who's not familiar with the term, a lay preacher is essentially a member of the congregation who leaves services but isn't like ordained clergy.
Gotcha.
And this fixation on Marie, well, it became a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
Michael's wife, Christine, she publicly accused them of having an inappropriate relationship.
Which, true or not, caused some serious tension within the group.
Yeah, for sure. And from there, things escalate. Michael has this violent outburst during a meeting. It was directed at Marie.
Yeah.
It's unsettling to think about that scene.
Yeah.
It makes you worry about his behavior.
Yeah, his behavior combined with, all the erratic behavior before that led the church leaders to a pretty drastic conclusion.
What's that?
They decided Michael was possessed by demons.
Oh.
Not just like one or two. They thought over 40 demons were present.
Over 40. That's wild. It really makes you think about how mental health was viewed back then.
Right. It's 1974. Mental illness was understood and treated so differently. Demonic possession, while it's less common as an explanation now, was a real possibility for them, a reason for strange or troubling behavior.
That's a really important point. So they decided to perform an exorcism on Michael. And this is where the story gets truly chilling. We're talking a full-blown all-night ceremony at St. Thomas's Church, led by Father Peter Vincent and Reverend Raymond Smith.
Yeah, the sources, they describe it in detail. It's intense, like not for the faint of heart.
I can imagine.
Witnesses described Michael thrashing, spitting, convulsing. They tied him down, used holy water, even forced a crucifix down his throat.
Oh, wow.
Like something out of a horror movie,
What? Yeah, it's hard to imagine what he was going through, especially if, like we're saying, he was already struggling with his mental health.
And here's another thing. The exorcists claimed that they only removed some of the demons.
Really?
They thought others, particularly the ones linked to insanity, murder, violence, those were still inside him.
And knowing what happens next, that's a chilling thought. Why release him to his wife's care? I mean, especially after all that, did they really believe they contained the threat?
Maybe they thought they'd done enough. I don't know. But what happened only hours after, it raises serious questions about their judgment. Because Michael Taylor, he committed a truly horrific act. He murdered his wife, Christine.
And the details of the murder are, well, they're tough to hear.
Oh.
The sources describe such brutality, it's almost impossible to comprehend.
It is.
He tore out her eyes and tongue with his bare hands, essentially ripped her face apart.
Oh my God.
And he strangled and dismembered their family dog. What's even more disturbing is that no murder weapon was found.
Oh God.
Just pure, raw violence.
We're sharing these details not for shock value, but because they're key to understanding the gravity of this case, all the complex questions it brings up.
I get it. And when the police arrested Michael, he said something truly haunting. He said, "They filled me with the devil. It was within her."
God.
Chilling, right? Those words, they speak volumes about his state of mind. Was he delusional? Manipulative? Or did he genuinely believe he was acting under the influence of demonic forces?
It's where mental illness, religious belief, and personal responsibility all get so blurred. What we do know is that this case goes way beyond a murder. It's a stark illustration of what can happen when beliefs become extreme, how vulnerable people can be influenced, whether by others or by their own minds.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's a heavy thought, for sure. The idea that someone could be so convinced of something that leads them to do something so horrific, it really sets the stage for this trial, which I imagine was quite the spectacle.
Oh, absolutely. The defense team for Michael Taylor, they made a pretty bold move. They went with the insanity plea. Oh, wow.
They argued that his mental state meant that he wasn't actually responsible for his actions.
So they were saying that he was so detached from reality that he couldn't understand that what he did was wrong.
Exactly, and that's like a core part of the insanity defense. It's not just about having a mental illness. It's about proving that the illness prevented the person from understanding, the nature and the consequences of what they were doing. In a legal sense, they're saying they didn't have the capacity to form criminal intent.
I see. But that must be hard to prove in court.
It is. It often involves expert testimony. From psychiatrists and psychologists, they have to evaluate the defendant's mental state.
Right.
And it brings up all these complex legal and ethical questions. On the one hand, you have the principle of holding people accountable for their actions. But on the other hand, there's the issue of fairness. Can someone really be held responsible if their mental illness prevented them from understanding what they did was wrong?
It's a tough question, a real moral dilemma. So what happened? What was the outcome of the trial? Well, the jury, they found Michael Taylor not guilty by reason of insanity.
Wow.
This was a huge decision, and it sparked all this debate about how the legal system approaches mental illness and criminal responsibility.
It makes the exorcism itself seem even more problematic, though, looking back.
Yeah.
I mean, if Michael was already mentally unstable, could the exorcism, with all of its intensity and those suggestions of demonic influence, could that have actually made his condition worse? Did it push him over the edge?
That's what experts have been wrestling with for years. Some people argue that the exorcism could have triggered a psychotic break in someone who was already prone to mental illness. The rituals, the language, the constant reinforcement of this idea that he was possessed. It could have all had a devastating impact on someone in a fragile mental state.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
They believed that he was possessed. They did this intense ritual to try and confront the possession, and then he commits this act that seems to confirm their initial belief.
Yeah, it's a terrifying cycle. But we should also think about the other side of the argument. Some experts say that Michael's violence, it came from his own struggles, inside of him, regardless of the exorcism.
Okay.
They say his mental illness was the main driver, and the exorcism was more of a catalyst, not the root cause.
So it becomes a question of, did the exorcism make an existing condition worse, or was it just a coincidence that this violent act happened after this intense religious experience? No easy answer, huh?
Nope, it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing. What we can say for sure is that this case really highlights the complexities of mental illness. And it shows the need for us to understand how belief systems can get mixed up with psychological vulnerabilities.
For sure. So what happened to Michael after the trial? He was acquitted, but he couldn't have just walked free, right?
No, you're right. He was found not legally responsible for the murder, but he was still considered a danger to himself and others, so he was committed to Broadmoor Hospital.
Broadmoor.
It's this high-security psychiatric facility. It's known for housing people who committed serious crimes due to mental illness.
That sounds pretty intense. What's it like?
Oh, Broadmoor's not your typical hospital. It's highly restrictive. It's designed to manage individuals who pose a real risk.
Okay.
Patients, they get treatment and therapy, but it's also about security.
Yeah.
Preventing any more harm.
Right.
So Michael, he spent 2 years at Broadmoor. Then he was moved to a secure ward in Bradford for another 2 years. Now, a secure ward, it's like a specialized unit within a hospital. It offers more supervision, more security than a general psychiatric ward.
So 4 years total, confined and in treatment. What happened after that? Did they just release him back into the community?
Well, yeah, eventually. They allowed him to go back to Ossett. And this is where it gets even more complicated. Releasing someone who committed such a brutal act, even if it was under the circumstances of an insanity plea, back into the community, it raises a ton of questions about the long-term effects of trauma, the effectiveness of treatment, that balance between public safety and the rights of individuals who have mental health issues.
It makes you wonder if he would reoffend. Did the system work? Was he really rehabilitated?
That's the big question. And honestly, we don't get a clear answer from the sources, but we do know his story doesn't end there.
This is where things get even more tragic, right?
Yeah.
I read that after his release, he really struggled to cope with what he did and the stigma from the case.
It seems that way. He attempted suicide multiple times, suggests some deep guilt and despair. Even though he wasn't legally responsible, he was carrying a huge burden.
It's a sad reminder that even when the legal system says someone isn't responsible, the personal and psychological consequences, they can be huge. They can last forever. It also shows the stigma around mental illness, especially when it involves violence.
For sure. Michael's case highlights the struggles that people face when they're trying to reintegrate into society after something so traumatic. The stigma, it's a lot to handle. It makes it hard to find acceptance, to find work, to feel like you belong.
It's a stark reminder that the legal process is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Yeah.
You can't ignore the human side of it. And then if that wasn't enough, Michael Taylor got in trouble with the law again. But this time for something completely different.
Yeah. In 2005, almost 30 years after his wife's murder, he was arrested for indecent assault against a teenage girl.
What?
This brought the whole case back into the public eye and made people question if he was still a threat.
That's shocking. It seems like his past, whether it was literal demons or just metaphorical ones, they just kept coming back.
This goes back to predicting future behavior, especially with someone who has a history of mental illness and violence.
Right.
It's a really complex and controversial area. There are tools and assessments, for evaluating risk.
Yeah.
But it's not a perfect science. Michael Taylor's case shows just how hard it is to know for sure if someone is a threat.
So after this arrest in 2005, what happened? Was he convicted of the assault?
Well, the specifics of that case, they're kind of vague in the sources.
Okay.
But they do mention that while he was in jail, waiting for trial, he started acting really strangely again. Like, people were worried about his mental state.
Wow.
They sent him for a psych evaluation and treatment. It seems like his mental health, it just continued to be this big factor throughout his life.
The whole case is so unsettling. We started with this ordinary guy living an ordinary life, and it just spiraled into this mess of violence and mental illness and spiritual stuff.
It really did. It leaves us with so many more questions than answers. Like, it challenges what we think we know about the human mind and the nature of belief and how limited our legal and mental health systems really are.
Yeah. It also makes you wonder, what happened to him in the end? Did Michael Taylor ever find any peace?
It's hard to say, With the information we have, we just don't know. His story kind of fades out after that 2005 arrest. It's almost like he just vanishes. But he leaves behind this legacy of tragedy and all these unanswered questions.
But his case, it still fascinates people and horrifies them.
Definitely.
It's a stark reminder, I guess, that darkness exists, even in seemingly ordinary lives.
It is. It's like a cautionary tale. It reminds us that human experience can be unpredictable. You can't always predict what's going to happen. It makes you think critically about what you read and what you believe, and it makes you question your assumptions. It's about approaching these complex issues with empathy and an open mind,
It reminds us that things aren't always black and white, good versus evil. Life is more complicated than that. And sometimes, the truth, it hides in the shadows, in the gray areas where you just can't be certain.
I agree. And it's in those gray areas that we often find the stories that really make you think. This case, it's been in books, documentaries, even a big horror film. It captures our imaginations because it makes us face our fears and wrestle with the mysteries of the human mind.
And this case has mysteries galore. Was he really possessed? Did the exorcism contribute to his violence? Or was he just a man dealing with mental illness, failed by the people who were supposed to be helping him? We might never know the answers for sure.
And maybe that's what keeps people so interested. It makes you feel uneasy. It reminds you that the world can be a dark and unpredictable place. And that sometimes the scariest truths are the ones we just can't explain.
Well, after that deep dive into the darkness, we'll leave you with one last thought. If you were on that jury, how would you have judged Michael Taylor? It's a tough one. No easy answers. But it might stick with you long after this is over.
And as always, we encourage you to keep digging, check out the sources, come to your own conclusions about this unsettling, tragic case.